Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take the world's most complicated figures and history-changing events, synthesize the source material, the documents, the biographies, the scholarly debates, and give you the essential, clear insights.
Today, we are deep diving into the life and the truly monumental legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte.
It's almost impossible to talk about the modern world without talking about Napoleon I.
It really is.
Yeah.
Our sources today are pulling from massive, comprehensive historical analysis covering his entire trajectory. I mean, the sheer volume of work on this one man is staggering.
And our mission here is to understand not just what he did, but how he did it so incredibly quickly, and why his influence remains so, well, so paradoxical.
Exactly. We're trying to synthesize that dual identity, the military genius on one hand and the revolutionary reformer on the other.
And that paradox is really what defines this deep dive. The essential question we have to grapple with is, it's stark. How can a single figure be responsible for enshrining the principle of equality before the law and secure property rights in the influential Napoleonic Code?
A code which influenced laws across the entire globe.
Right. While at the same time choosing to reinstate colonial slavery.
That tension between the Enlightenment ideal and, frankly, ruthless despotism runs through his entire life. He was both the product of the French Revolution and, in many ways, its eventual destroyer.
So to understand that contradiction, we have to start not with the emperor, not with the conqueror, but with the angry, ambitious outsider from a recently acquired island.
Okay, so let's begin with a very specific and, I think, crucial date. Napoleon was born Napoleone Bonaparte in Ajaccio, Corsica in 1769.
And that year is just so vital, isn't it?
It's everything, because France had formally acquired the island from Genoa only 1 year before, in 1768.
So if he'd been born just a couple years earlier, he would have been born Italian.
Exactly. His background wasn't mainland French at all. His family, the Bonapartes, were minor Tuscan nobility. He grew up speaking Corsican and Italian. French was his second language.
And that detail fundamentally shaped his early identity, right? When he was sent off to military school, first at Autun, then Brienne-le-Château, he was truly an outsider.
Completely. I mean, you have to picture it. He shows up speaking French with this thick Corsican accent. His spelling was notoriously erratic his entire life, and his manners were different.
He must have been a target for the other students.
A huge target. He was routinely bullied by his wealthier, more aristocratic French peers. And this wasn't just, typical schoolyard teasing. It reinforced this deep sense of being an other.
So what does he do with that exclusion? Does he try to fit in?
No, quite the opposite. He turns inward. He becomes reserved, almost melancholic, and applies himself intensely to his studies. He just buries himself in books.
What was he reading?
Classical history, Plutarch, Caesar, but critically, mathematics. That's where he showed exceptional aptitude.
Which makes perfect sense for a future artillery officer.
Absolutely. It was a world of pure logic, of analytical rigor, of numbers, a world where your accent or your family's income didn't matter. Only the correct answer did. That focus served him incredibly well later as a logistical strategist.
And initially, his loyalty wasn't even to France. Our sources really highlight this. He was an outspoken Corsican nationalist.
Oh, passionately so. He was a huge admirer of Pasquale Paoli, the man who led the Corsican War of Independence against France.
So the future emperor of France starts out as an anti-French revolutionary. That's an incredible irony.
It is. It makes his eventual path all the more astonishing. But his father, Carlo, was a pragmatist, a political operator.
Right. Carlo saw which way the wind was blowing.
He did. After the Corsican defeat, Carlo switched sides, befriended the French governor, and, critically, secured Napoleon a royal bursary to attend that military academy.
So that bursary was the key. It unlocked the entire French system for him, even though he still harbored this deep resentment against it.
It was the only way in. But the real shift, the thing that changed everything, was the French Revolution itself.
It presented an opportunity that was just far greater than Corsican separatism could ever offer.
Infinitely greater. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in 1785. Once the revolution erupts, Napoleon quickly identifies with the Jacobins and the revolutionary cause. He sees Paoli's renewed secessionist dreams as, well, reactionary and small-minded.
So his loyalty shifts.
It shifts to the French Convention, which, after the emigration of thousands of aristocratic officers, was desperately short of capable commanders. Suddenly, meritocracy became the fastest path up the ladder.
And that path just explodes onto the national scene at the Siege of Toulon in 1793.
Toulon is the ultimate proof of the revolutionary promise. promotion based purely on merit.
So set the scene for us. What was happening at Toulon?
Okay, so this is a crucial Mediterranean port, and it's been occupied by Allied forces, mainly British and Spanish, who were supporting the royalist cause. Napoleon is just a young captain, recently appointed artillery commander.
And he comes up with a plan.
A brilliant, counterintuitive plan. The senior generals wanted a direct, bloody assault. Napoleon looked at the terrain and identified a hill fort, La Guillette.
What was so special about this hill?
It overlooked the harbor. He realized that if they could capture it, they could place their Republican guns there and dominate the entire anchorage, cutting off the British fleet from the city.
So he didn't have to defeat the army in the city, he just had to make their position impossible.
Exactly, force them to evacuate. And he didn't just propose the plan, he led the assault himself and was wounded in the thigh. The successful assault in December 1793 forces the Allies to withdraw their ships.
And his reward?
A promotion to brigadier general. At age 24, this is what brings him to the attention of powerful political figures in Paris, notably Augustin Robespierre, Maximilian's younger brother.
But that connection to the Jacobins quickly becomes a liability, doesn't it? When Maximilian Robespierre falls in 1794 during the Thermidorian reaction.
That's right. The Thermidorian reaction was the moderate backlash against the radical terror. And because of his association with the Robespierres, Napoleon gets briefly arrested. He's out of favor for a time.
But the political instability of the new government, the Directory, gives him his second big chance.
It does. This leads us to the famous 13 Vendémiaire uprising in October 1795. This is where he cements his role as a political player.
So this is a royalist rebellion in the streets of Paris.
A massive armed rebellion against the National Convention. Paul Barras, who's the powerful leader of the Directory, is in a panic. He puts Napoleon in command of the forces defending the convention.
And this is where he delivers what became known as a whiff of grape shot.
That phrase, whether he said it or not, captures the moment perfectly. Grape shot is essentially a cannon-loaded canister of small iron balls. It turns the artillery piece into a giant shotgun.
So he wasn't using standard cannonballs.
No. He recognized that massed infantry fire wouldn't stop thousands of determined, organized royalists who were converging on the Tuileries Palace. He needed overwhelming, terrifying force.
He used pure artillery power on a civilian population to secure the government.
It was ruthless, incredibly effective, and politically daring. He had his cavalry officer, Joachim Murat, seize cannons from a nearby camp, deployed them strategically, and just fired these devastating canister rounds directly into the charging rebels. It crushed the revolt almost instantly.
The action secured the stability of the Directory and made Napoleon indispensable.
Completely. And that political currency he earned was immediately followed by a personal transformation. The sources note that just weeks after this, he was romantically involved with and soon married Josephine de Beauharnais,
who was a prominent socialite and, conveniently, the former mistress of Barras himself.
a brilliant social maneuver. Josephine gave him entry into the highest political and social circles of Paris. This period really marks the formal shedding of his outsider identity.
He even changes his name.
He permanently adopts the French spelling Napoleon Bonaparte, moving away from the Italian Napoleone di Buonaparte. He was no longer the accented Corsican boy. He was Napoleon, the political fixer, and the hero of the Republic.
And this solidified his status, earning him the promotion in early 1796 to lead the financially starved yet strategically vital Army of Italy.
So Napoleon is now 26 years old, he's married into high society, and suddenly he's in command of the Army of Italy for the 1796-1797 campaign.
And this is an army that was in terrible shape.
Terrible. Poorly supplied, demoralized, they hadn't been paid. He took this wreck of an army and turned it into an engine of conquest and wealth creation.
It was a masterclass in aggressive offensive strategy. What was his key insight?
Speed. It was always speed, moving faster than the enemy could possibly organize. He basically ignored traditional supply lines, forcing his army to live off the land.
Which would have been controversial, but it allowed him to move quickly.
Incredibly quickly. It allowed him to rapidly concentrate his forces where the enemy was weak. He defeated the Piedmontese and knocked them out of the war in just 2 weeks before their powerful Austrian allies could even effectively intervene.
And the sheer scale of his success is what just shocked Europe. He won these key battles like Arcole and Rivoli.
Rivoli in particular was a definitive victory. It just shattered the Austrian position in northern Italy. And when you look at the numbers from that campaign, they really speak volumes about his tactical superiority.
What are we talking about?
Well, the sources say 67 actions fought, 18 pitched battles won. and he secured 150,000 prisoners, 540 cannons, and 170 standards. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was a demonstration of a new kind of warfare built on speed and audacity.
But this campaign was equally famous for its systematic monetization. This is where we see the first major signs of his institutionalized exploitation of conquered territory.
Precisely. Napoleon was expected to fund his own army, and he did so with gusto. The estimates of wealth he extracted from Italy are just vast.
We're talking about cash, right?
Talking 45 million French pounds in currency, plus another 12 million in precious metals and jewels. But perhaps more lasting was the organized plunder of culture.
The art theft.
Yes. Over 300 paintings and sculptures, including works by Titian and Raphael, were systematically cataloged and shipped back to France to fill the Musée du Louvre. He effectively established a precedent that conquest meant the right to claim cultural heritage.
And he didn't rely on the Directory's interpretation of his actions back in Paris. He became his own primary source of news.
That's the crucial insight into his political genius. While he was still in the field, he founded and oversaw 2 newspapers. One for his troops, the Courrier de l'Armée d'Italie, and another for French domestic circulation.
So he's creating the narrative.
He is filtering, framing, and projecting his image directly back to Paris, bypassing the government censor and ensuring the story of the Italian campaign was one of pure, unparalleled triumph.
He used this political capital immediately, intervening in Paris politics and making the Directory even more dependent on it.
To the point where they got nervous. So, trying to keep its ambitious general occupied, they shipped him off to the Egyptian expedition in 1798. Was this genuinely about national security or just distracting Napoleon?
A bit of both, I imagine.
It was a bit of both, but primarily geopolitical. The main strategic goal was to undermine Britain's vital trade links to India.
How would Egypt do that?
The idea was to establish a French presence in the Middle East, maybe even build a canal at Suez, and potentially link up with anti-British powers in India, like Tipu Sultan in Mysore. He personally assured the Directory he would establish a supply chain and, quote, attack the English in their possessions.
What's so fascinating about the Egyptian expedition is this juxtaposition of brutal conquest with genuine Enlightenment curiosity.
Absolutely. This is the dual nature of Napoleon in high relief. Alongside his army of soldiers, he brought 167 savants, scientists, mathematicians, naturalists, geodesists.
They weren't just along for the ride.
Not at all. They were undertaking a full-scale, systematic study of Egyptian culture, history, flora, fauna, and resources.
Which led to some monumental discoveries, right?
Yes, their work was compiled into the massive Foundational Description de l'Égypte, which was published starting in 1809, and of course the big one. During construction for a fort, French soldiers discovered the Rosetta Stone.
The key to unlocking ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs.
The very key. So this blending of military conquest and scientific exploration, it's really unique to the Napoleonic era.
But militarily, the expedition quickly descended into a disaster.
It was a tale of 2 theaters. On land, the French were initially very successful. They achieved a major victory over the Mameluke cavalry at the Battle of the Pyramids.
This is where he gives that famous speech.
Soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon you. But just 10 days later, the entire situation was reversed at sea.
Admiral
Horatio Nelson. At the Battle of the Nile, he destroyed or captured all but 2 vessels of the French fleet, completely isolating Bonaparte's army in Egypt. They were trapped.
And the land campaign quickly spiraled into just brutal violence, particularly when he moved into Syria.
Yes. The siege and subsequent capture of Jaffa in March 1799 are a real dark stain on his record. Upon taking the town, Napoleon discovered that many of the vendors were former prisoners of war who had been paroled.
Meaning they had sworn never to fight against the French again?
Exactly. Instead of releasing them again, Napoleon ordered the execution of the entire garrison. Somewhere between 1,500 and 5,000 prisoners of war. They were marched to the beach and summarily executed by bayonet or drowning to save ammunition.
The whole campaign was catastrophic. Not just the fighting, but disease.
Thousands of the 13,000 troops he started with perished from disease, primarily the bubonic plague. But despite the isolation and the losses, Napoleon realized the French Directory back in Paris was in far greater trouble. It was reeling from defeats in the War of the Second Coalition and was widely unpopular.
He saw his political opening.
He did. But wait, he was isolated, his army was decimated and stranded, so how was he met as a hero, not a deserter, when he got back to Paris?
That's where the cultivated image and the Directory's weakness intersect.
Right. He had been broadcasting his victory through his own newspapers for 2 years. France was bankrupt. terrified of foreign invasion and utterly disgusted with its government. When Napoleon landed in France in August 1799, having slipped past the British blockade and just leaving his army to General Kleber, he was seen as the indispensable man of action.
Which sets the stage for the dramatic coup of 18 Brumaire.
In November 1799, Napoleon allied himself with powerful, disaffected politicians like Talleyrand and Sieyès, who believed the Directory was failing and needed a strong executive. Napoleon brought the military muscle.
Grenadiers with fixed bayonets.
Yes, who forced the Council of 500 to dissolve the government. They appointed Bonaparte, Sieyès, and Ducos as provisional consuls.
And within a month, he consolidates all the power under the new constitution of the year 8, establishing the French consulate. This is where we see that soft despotism that characterizes his civilian rule.
It was a dictatorship wrapped in the language of the Republic. The Constitution established various elected bodies, yes, but real power was entirely concentrated in Napoleon as the first consul. The other two were merely advisory.
So his regime was instantly characterized by historians as a dictatorship by plebiscite.
Using the popular vote, or plebiscite, to confirm authoritarian policies. It was a new model of power.
How is this new authoritarianism immediately visible to the public?
Through systematic repression and centralization. He immediately introduced censorship, drastically curtailing the free press. He closed most opposition newspapers to stifle dissent.
And he centralized all local administration.
By appointing prefects, ensuring that power flowed vertically from Paris down to the smallest village. However, and this is key, he was smart enough to balance this with genuinely popular moves. He raised key taxes, secured loans to stabilize property values, and offered amnesty to most aristocratic émigrés who were willing to return.
But the regime needed a victorious peace to secure its long-term survival. That led to the massive military maneuver that secured his position, the Battle of Marengo in 1800.
Marengo was essential. To surprise the Austrians, Napoleon led his army across the Swiss Alps, a feat comparable to Hannibal. He initially walked into a surprise attack and was nearly defeated.
But then a late arrival saves the day.
The late arrival of General Louis' division saved the French position, completely reversing the battle's tide. This victory forced Austria to abandon northern Italy and led to the Treaty of Luneville in 1801, which confirmed French territorial gains and secured temporary peace.
And that popularity allowed him to take the next monumental step, becoming consul for life.
In May 1802, the Council of State proposed a plebiscite. The official results, though certainly inflated by his brother Lucien's manipulations, showed massive public support, 3.6 million in favor. This level of demonstrated political authority, cemented by military victory, made his position virtually unassailable.
But right here, at the absolute peak of his civilian popularity, we hit that moral nadir that defines the core contradiction of his legacy, the reinstatement of slavery.
It is the critical moral failure. The French National Convention had abolished slavery back in 1794, a truly radical move. But in May 1802, Bonaparte reintroduced it in all French colonies that he expected to recover.
Why? What was the driver for that decision?
It was largely driven by pressure from the powerful plantation lobby and the belief that the economic vitality of the French Caribbean, especially its sugar production, required forced labor. It was a cold economic calculation.
And this led directly to the catastrophic expedition to Saint-Domingue, which ultimately failed.
He sent a massive force to retake Saint-Domingue from Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. The French troops were just ravaged by a disease, particularly yellow fever, and suffered repeated military defeats.
So he was forced to acknowledge defeat.
He was. This failure was historic. It led directly to the Independent Republic of Haiti in 1804, the only successful slave revolt in world history.
And that failure had geopolitical consequences that reshaped North America, resulting in the Louisiana Purchase.
Absolutely. The inability to defend or maintain the vast Louisiana territory, combined with the imminent renewal of war with Britain in 1803, meant Napoleon desperately needed funds. The Haitian failure convinced him that maintaining a massive American empire was untenable.
So he sold it.
He sold the entire territory to the United States for $15 million, effectively doubling the size of the young American Republic overnight.
So the peace secured by the Treaty of Amiens doesn't last long, breaking down by 1803. By 1804, Napoleon is ready for the final step in securing his power, moving from consul for life to establishing a hereditary empire. What was the catalyst for this dramatic elevation?
The catalyst was fear, really, masked as stabilization. A major royalist plot to kidnap or assassinate him was uncovered in early 1804.
And his allies used that.
His political allies, like Fouché, convinced him that the only way to secure the revolutionary gains and prevent future plots was to make the state hereditary. If he died, the regime would collapse unless there was a guaranteed line of succession. The argument was, they want to kill a man, we must give them a dynasty.
But this transition involved an act of pure, shocking political violence, the execution of the Duke of Enghien.
It was a cold-blooded demonstration of ruthlessness. On the advice of Talleyrand, Napoleon ordered the kidnapping of the Duke of Enghien from neutral territory in Baden, a flagrant violation of that state's sovereignty.
And the Duke wasn't even involved in the plot.
There was no real proof he was directly involved, but he was a Bourbon prince. He was quickly shuttled to Vincennes, put through a secret military trial, and executed by firing squad in the castle moat.
Why did that specific act shock Europe so profoundly?
It wasn't just another execution. It was the extrajudicial killing of royalty, the heir of the great House of Condé. It signaled to every monarch in Europe, especially Tsar Alexander of Russia, that Napoleon was not just a general or a consul, but a tyrant willing to operate entirely outside the traditional rules of sovereignty and law.
It permanently poisoned the well of trust.
It did. But despite the international outcry, in May 1804, the Senate proclaimed him Napoleon I, Emperor of the French. And he solidified this new status with his coronation.
The coronation in December 1804 at Notre Dame, that was pure political theater.
High-stakes political theater. He had Pope Pius VII travel all the way from Rome to attend, lending religious legitimacy to the new empire. But Napoleon's most famous, most defiant act was taking the crown from the Pope's hands and crowning himself first.
And then crowning Josephine.
This wasn't just pageantry. It was a clear signal that his authority derived not from the church or from divine right, but from his own will and the will of the French people, as represented by the state.
And he didn't just stop at Emperor of France.
No. By 1805, he also declared himself King of Italy, flying to Milan and crowning himself to the ancient Iron Crown of Lombardy, reinforcing his claim over those northern Italian territories. From this point on, the goal is not merely national defense, it's continental hegemony.
So from 1805 to 1807, Napoleon reaches his absolute military zenith, demonstrating the sheer logistical and strategic power of his Grande Armée. How large was this force, and what was its tactical secret?
At its height in 1805, the Grande Armée numbered around 350,000 men, and its tactical secret really lay in its organization. It was divided into corps.
What's a corps?
A self-sufficient all-arms formation, basically a mini-army with its own infantry, cavalry, and artillery, capable of independent action for a day or two. This allowed him to maintain an incredible marching pace, confuse enemies about his main target, and then concentrate massive firepower precisely when and where it was needed.
And this speed yielded immediate stunning results against the Third Coalition. Let's look at the 1805 campaign, particularly Ulm.
Ulm is taught in military academies worldwide as a classic example of maneuver warfare. The Austrian commander, Karl Mack, concentrated most of his forces in the Bavarian fortress of Ulm, expecting Napoleon to attack him head-on from the east.
But Napoleon didn't.
Napoleon's forces executed a massive, rapid flanking maneuver. They marched from the English Channel to the Danube in just 5 weeks. They completely outflanked and surrounded the Austrians before they even really knew the French army was there.
And the result was the surrender of 60,000 Austrians, with Napoleon suffering minimal casualties. That's just incredible.
It was strategically decisive, but that spectacular land victory was immediately overshadowed by the simultaneous naval disaster at Trafalgar in October 1805.
Nelson again.
While Napoleon could dictate the destiny of continents, Nelson's victory meant the Royal Navy's dominance of the seas was absolute. Napoleon would never seriously challenge Britain directly again.
Still, the momentum continued on land, leading to what Napoleon himself called his finest battle, Austerlitz.
Austerlitz, in December 1805, was an operational masterpiece against the combined Austrian and Russian forces. Napoleon brilliantly feigned weakness on his right flank.
Drawing them in.
Exactly, enticing the Allies to move their main forces off the strategic high ground, the Pratzen Heights, to crush what they thought was a vulnerable point.
But it was a trap.
A perfectly laid trap. Once the Allies committed their forces to the flank, Napoleon launched his hidden reserve to retake the heights, splitting the Allied army in two and routing them completely.
The victory was comprehensive, leading to the dissolution of the ancient Holy Roman Empire.
The Treaty of Pressburg forced Austria out of the coalition and reorganized Central Europe under French influence, leading to the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine. His dominance just continued. In 1806, the overwhelming defeat of Prussia at Jena Auerstedt, and then the subsequent defeat of Russia at Friedland in 1807.
All of this leads to the famous dramatic treaties of Tilsit in 1807.
Tilsit seals his continental mastery. Napoleon meets Tsar Alexander I on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. It's this theatrical display of parity between the emperors of the West and East.
And Russia gets off relatively lightly.
They do. Russia was given lenient terms, primarily demanding they join his continental system against Britain. Prussia, however, was treated with extreme contempt.
How so?
It lost half its territory, was forced to pay a massive indemnity, and was left politically humiliated. Queen Louise of Prussia had to personally beg Napoleon for mercy, which he refused. This humiliation sowed seeds of deep, lasting Prussian resentment that would eventually come back to haunt him.
So by 1808, he is the undisputed master of Europe. But this is precisely where the seeds of ruin begin to sprout, starting with the Peninsular War, which he himself later called the Spanish Ulcer.
The intention was defensive, at least in his mind. It was about enforcing the continental system, this mandatory economic blockade aimed at crippling British trade. To do that, he needed to control the entire coastline.
Which meant invading Portugal, which was still trading with Britain.
Right. And to invade Portugal, he had to march through Spain. When Spanish King Charles IV resisted, Napoleon intervened, forced the Bourbons out, and installed his brother Joseph as King of Spain in 1808.
And that political maneuvering was met with a massive popular uprising, which turned into years of brutal conflict.
It was an immediate, visceral reaction. The Spanish people, driven by a combination of nationalism and clerical opposition to the French Revolution's secularism, waged a relentless guerrilla warfare. This was a war of attrition, not the grand set-piece battles Napoleon excelled at.
And guerrilla warfare was uniquely devastating to the Grande Armée's logistics.
Absolutely. The Grande Armée was structured for rapid advances and decisive battles. It relied on foraging and rapid resupply. Guerrilla bands disrupted these fragile supply lines, forcing a massive commitment of troops just to guard roads and chase shadows.
What was the cost?
The campaign tied up 300,000 seasoned French troops from 1808 to 1812 and cost France over 150,000 casualties. Napoleon confessed in exile that this unlucky war ruined me. It was a constant drain of resources and experienced manpower that he just couldn't afford.
That strategic blunder then sets the stage for the ultimate catastrophe, the invasion of Russia in 1812. What were the specific political tensions that led to this monumental decision?
The relationship with Tsar Alexander I, which was cemented at Tilsit, was rapidly deteriorating. Alexander saw Napoleon's political consolidation in Europe, particularly annexing the Duchy of Oldenburg, whose duke was Alexander's uncle, and Napoleon's continued support for a Polish state as a direct threat to Russian interests.
But the final trigger was economic.
Yes, Alexander openly defied the continental system by allowing neutral shipping into Russian ports, which was basically a backdoor for British trade. For Napoleon, that was an act of economic warfare.
So he mobilizes an unprecedented force, but it was profoundly multinational, right?
Yes. The invading force, the Grande Armée of 1812, comprised around 450,000 frontline troops, but only about a third were native French speakers. It included huge contingents of Poles, Germans, Italians, and Austrians. This diversity created serious communication and loyalty challenges under stress.
And his initial strategy was the same as always.
Force the Russians into one or two decisive border battles, crush their army, and force the Tsar to the negotiating table.
The Russians, however, employed a brilliant, devastating counter-strategy, scorched earth.
A nightmare for the invaders. Under generals like Barclay de Tolly and leader Kutuzov, the Russians continuously retreated, drawing the French deeper and deeper into the vast Russian interior.
And as they retreated, they burned everything.
They implemented a scorched earth policy, destroying crops, wells, and homes. This made it virtually impossible for the massive French army, which was already struggling with logistics, to forage for food for themselves and their horses. Horses died off in the tens of thousands, crippling the cavalry and artillery transport.
The only way to stop the French was a decisive battle, which finally happened outside Moscow at Borodino.
Borodino on September 7th was one of the bloodiest single days of battle in the history of European warfare up to that time. It was a tactical victory for the French. They took the field, but it was a Pyrrhic one.
The cost was staggering.
44,000 Russian casualties and 35,000 French casualties. And the Russian army, though badly beaten, was not destroyed. It was able to retreat in good order.
Napoleon pushed on and occupied Moscow, only to find it burning.
Yes. The governor, Fyodor Ostapchin, had ordered the city set alight, denying Napoleon the strategic and symbolic prize of a winter capital. Napoleon waited for 6 weeks in the burning city, expecting Tsar Alexander in St. Petersburg to sue for peace.
And the message never came.
Alexander refused all negotiations. With winter rapidly approaching, Napoleon's army was forced to begin the disastrous retreat.
And describe the horrors of that retreat. It's really the iconic image of Napoleon's downfall.
It was an absolute disintegration. It turned the proud Grande Armée into a starving, disorganized mob. The forces suffered immensely from disease, starvation, and constant harrying by Cossack raiders and armed peasants.
And then the winter hit.
Critically, they were caught by the full force of the Russian winter. Temperatures plummeted to minus 40 degrees Celsius. The cold literally froze men solid in their saddles and turned the retreat into a death march.
What was the final toll of this disaster?
By the time the ragged remnants of the army finally crossed the Niemen River back into Poland in December, only around 75,000 effective troops remained out of the initial invasion force. The total human cost for the entire campaign, including the fighting, disease, and the retreat, was catastrophic, contributing to up to 1 million total military deaths on all sides. Napoleon had gambled everything and had lost his entire military machine.
The catastrophe in Russia immediately emboldened all of Napoleon's enemies. The Sixth Coalition formed quickly in 1813, uniting Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Britain against him.
And the coalition had learned its lessons. They had immense superiority in armaments and, more importantly, reserves of manpower. Napoleon was forced to rely on younger, less experienced conscripts, the so-called Marie-Louises.
Despite winning several battles early in 1813, like Lutzen and Bautzen, he was decisively defeated at the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813.
Famously known as the Battle of the Nations. It was the largest battle of the entire Napoleonic Wars, a 3-day slugfest involving 500,000 soldiers. The French lost 38,000 killed or wounded and 15,000 taken prisoner. It was a crushing defeat.
And after Leipzig, he was offered a chance to save his throne and end the war under what were called the Frankfurt Proposals. He refused.
He did. He refused what seemed like a generous offer. The proposal suggested peace based on France's natural frontiers, the Rhine, the Alps, and the Pyrenees.
Why would he turn that down?
Because Napoleon, believing his military reputation was synonymous with French power, felt this limited boundary would permanently weaken his authority. He believed even then that he could still win. His refusal led the Allies to invade France itself in January 1814.
And the final defense of France was desperate, but by all accounts, tactically brilliant.
It was. He managed to win a series of stunning victories in the Six Days Campaign in February 1814 against forces much larger than his own. But the sheer weight of numbers eventually overwhelmed him. He was forced to retreat at Austerlitz.
And the coalition marched directly on an undefended Paris.
When the capital fell, Napoleon, realizing his senior marshals were exhausted and unwilling to continue the fight, was forced to accept the inevitable.
And his eventual abdication was conditional, right? He tried to save the dynasty.
Initially, yes. At the Palace of Fontainebleau, he attempted to abdicate in favor of his young son, Napoleon II. However, Tsar Alexander I insisted on unconditional abdication, which Napoleon reluctantly agreed to on April 6, 1814. He was then exiled to the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba.
His first exile sounds almost like a miniature version of his life as a reformer.
He couldn't sit still, could he? He was made sovereign of this tiny island, population 12,000, and he immediately treated it like a miniature empire. In the first few months, he was drawing up plans for administrative reforms, road construction, building works, improving the island's mines and agriculture. It was the administrative genius applied to a postage stamp.
But this miniature empire didn't last long. Less than a year later, he was back for the 100 Days.
His escape in February 1815 was driven by deep dissatisfaction. The treaty terms had promised him a stipend that was not being paid. He heard credible rumors he was about to be banished to a much more remote island, and he knew the restored Bourbon king, Louis VIII, was desperately unpopular in France.
He saw an opportunity.
He saw an opportunity, and he took it. He landed in France with about 1,000 men.
And the story of his return is famous for one moment in particular, his confrontation with the 5th Regiment.
It's the moment that really solidifies his personal magnetism and charisma. When the 5th Regiment was ordered to stop him near Grenoble, Napoleon approached their line alone, threw open his coat, and challenged them directly. "Here I am. Kill your emperor if you wish."
And they didn't.
The response was immediate and overwhelming. Vive l'empereur. The entire regiment defected. Within days, Marshal Michel Ney, who had promised Louis VIII he would bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage, defected with 6,000 men. Louis VIII fled, and Napoleon effortlessly retook Paris without a shot being fired.
The European powers, however, were not amused. They formed the Seventh Coalition, which led directly to the final defining military defeat, Waterloo.
Waterloo, June 1815, marked the end. Napoleon's forces engaged the British army under the Duke of Wellington near Brussels. It was a close-run thing, a very bloody battle.
But the Prussians arrived.
The timely, decisive arrival of the Prussian forces under Field Marshal Blücher broke the French lines. The defeat was final and complete.
He returned to Paris, abdicated a second time, and realizing he had no political recourse, surrendered to the British aboard HMS Bellerophon. This led to his permanent exile on Saint Helena.
A conscious choice by the British to place him as far away from Europe as humanly possible. Saint Helena is incredibly remote, 1,870 kilometers from the coast of Africa in the South Atlantic. It was a prison island, heavily guarded by 2,100 soldiers and a squadron of 10 ships constantly patrolling the waters.
And the conditions of his imprisonment at Longwood House were notoriously poor.
It was a damp, windswept, rat-infested wooden bungalow. Not exactly an imperial palace, but despite the squalor, Napoleon insisted on maintaining strict imperial formality.
What do you mean?
His staff wore military dress for dinner, and the women wore evening gowns. This was a deliberate act of psychological resistance, an insistence that he was still the emperor, not merely General Bonaparte, as the British called him. He spent his time dictating his memoirs, carefully crafting his historical narrative for posterity.
His health declined sharply in his final years. What do modern sources tell us about his death?
He was confined to bed by March 1821 and died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51. The medical findings from the autopsy, including recent analysis, overwhelmingly point to internal bleeding caused by stomach cancer. It was the same disease that killed his father.
Yet the persistent theory of arsenic poisoning remains this powerful historical footnote.
It does, primarily because high concentrations of arsenic were found in hair samples taken after his death. However, this is significantly complicated by the fact that high arsenic concentrations were also found in hair samples taken from Napoleon during his childhood, as well as from his son and Josephine.
So it was just more common back then?
Arsenic is simply common in 19th century products. It was used in medicines, dyes, wallpaper glues, and common building materials, making the poisoning theory extremely difficult to prove definitively.
And long after his death, his legacy was secured when his remains were finally transferred back to Paris.
In 1840, the British government permitted the transfer. When his remains were exhumed, they were found to be remarkably well preserved. The subsequent grand state funeral in Paris was a massive political spectacle, with up to 1 million attendees lining the procession route to Les Invalides, where his tomb is today.
And that act, nearly 2 decades after his death, really cemented the romantic legend of Napoleon as a national hero and ensured his place in the pantheon of French history.
So when we step back from the battles and the campaigns, we have to synthesize the lasting impact of his domestic rule, which outlived his empire. He wasn't just a military genius, he was a revolutionary administrative genius.
And that administrative brilliance is his most enduring legacy. The centerpiece, without question, is the Napoleonic Code.
Formally implemented in March 1804. Before this, France had this chaotic mix of hundreds of regional laws, local customs, and old Roman law traditions. It was a mess.
What made the code so revolutionary in its structure?
Its clarity and its accessibility. It replaced all that chaos with a single, clearly written secular legal code designed to apply equally to all men across the entire nation.
And its fundamental contributions were pure Enlightenment principles.
Exactly. Equality before the law, the final abolition of feudalism, and securing property rights. It also introduced civil marriage and divorce, taking those things out of the hands of the church.
The global impact of this is just massive, isn't it?
It was propagated by his armies across Europe, serving as the legal foundation for French satellite states in Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands. But its influence spread far beyond his empire, shaping legal systems throughout Latin America, the Middle East, and even parts of North America like Quebec. It truly democratized law.
And beyond the legal system, his handprints are all over the structure of the modern French state.
He centralized power with ruthless efficiency. He established the system of prefects in 1800, who were appointed directly from Paris to administer France's regional departments. This ensured uniformity and consolidated authority in the capital.
He also founded the Council of State,
An elite advisory body of experts that remains highly influential in France today, drafting legislation and overseeing administrative justice.
And he standardized everything, didn't he? Eliminating that local hodgepodge of the past.
Absolutely. He officially introduced the metric system in 1801, which his armies then spread across Western Europe. He also got rid of the confusing revolutionary calendar in 1805, returning to the Gregorian calendar, which was a pragmatic move that helped stabilize economic and social life.
He also recognized that a strong state needed skilled people. His education reforms were key to producing those professionals.
He was intensely focused on producing efficient bureaucrats, engineers, and military officers. So while he largely left primary schooling to local communes, he founded the elite lycées and the Grande École, like the École Polytechnique,
Which were meritocratic.
powerhouses of meritocracy, designed to ensure that talent, regardless of background, could rise to serve the state.
And that focus on meritocracy was institutionalized with the Legion of Honor.
Instituted in 1802, the Legion of Honor was designed to reward distinguished service, whether it was civilian or military. It remains the highest French decoration today and was a powerful tool to reinforce the idea that the empire was built on talent, not on birthright.
But this is where we must immediately return to the paradox. This champion of meritocracy simultaneously created a new, hereditary imperial nobility.
That's the contradiction you simply cannot ignore. After establishing the Legion of Honor, he went on to create a whole new system of hereditary princes, dukes, counts, and barons. Ultimately, he created over 3,000 new nobles who received huge land grants from conquered territories.
So he used meritocracy to dismantle the old aristocracy, only to replace it with a new one loyal only to him.
Precisely. Now we have to address the other side of the ledger. Many historians argue that these modernizing benefits came at an intolerable, profoundly authoritarian cost.
And the criticism is severe and must be impartially reported.
It must. His expansionist Napoleonic Wars cost an estimated 6 million lives across Europe, a staggering demographic disaster that economically disrupted an entire generation. Critics argue that his willingness to commit massive troop formations into extraordinarily bloody battles like Borodino reflected a profound disregard for the value of his soldiers' lives, viewing them as disposable units in a grand strategy.
And the authoritarian nature of the code and his administration, that can't be whitewashed.
No. We have to reiterate the profound authoritarian elements. His regime abolished the free press and implemented strict, pervasive censorship. He dismissed independent judges and continuously bypassed the representative government he had ostensibly established. And furthermore, the social regression within the very legal system he championed is undeniable.
What specifically was the social regression in the code?
It severely reduced the civil rights of women and children compared to certain pre-revolutionary customs. The code reinforced patriarchal authority to an extreme degree. Wives were legally subordinate to their husbands, unable to sign contracts, open bank accounts, or manage their own property without their husband's consent. This was a significant step backward for women's rights, all under the guise of legal uniformity.
And we can't forget the financial exploitation used to sustain his constant warfare.
To finance the Grande Armée, he systematically imposed increased taxes and levies on his satellite states. Critically, the continental system wasn't just about damaging Britain. It enforced discriminatory tariff policies that favored French industry while crushing the economies of his allies and conquered territories. And of course, the institutionalized plunder of art continued throughout his entire reign.
Finally, let's discuss his incredible success in shaping his own memory, even from exile.
Napoleon was an absolute master of propaganda. He used commissions of art and strict censorship during his reign to portray himself as the savior of France, the restorer of order, the man who brought stability after the chaos of the revolution.
But the lasting myth was forged in the fire of his defeat.
Absolutely. The memoirs he dictated to Las Cases during his time on Saint Helena, which were published as the Memorial of Saint Helena, were a work of pure genius as propaganda. They created this powerful, romantic legend of Napoleon as a liberal, visionary proponent of European unification, a victim deposed by the reactionary Old World monarchies.
And that narrative was incredibly effective.
It was. This highly sympathetic narrative sustained the Bonapartist cause for decades and profoundly influenced subsequent European literature and art.
So when we synthesize this entire life, the outsider, the reformer, the despot, the conqueror, what was the long-term unintentional global influence of this European tyrant?
Ironically, his destructive military campaigns were the greatest vector for spreading the liberal values of the revolution he claimed to champion. Wherever his armies went, they abolished feudalism, liberalized property laws, ended institutions like the Spanish Inquisition, and closed Jewish ghettos, spreading formal religious equality and secular administration.
And his geopolitical restructuring had massive reverberations that lasted long after his empire fell.
His reorganization of the fragmented German territories, reducing the patchwork of hundreds of states that made up the Holy Roman Empire into the streamlined Confederation of the Rhine, was an unintentional catalyst for both German and Italian nationalism. By making these territories more uniform, he ironically fostered the desire for political unification that dominated the later 19th century.
And perhaps the most enduring consequence for the rest of the world, Latin America.
The power vacuum created by his invasion of Spain and the forced ousting of the Bourbon monarchy in 1808 directly began the process of Latin American independence. Spanish colonies, deprived of their legitimate king and facing French interference, began declaring autonomy. This indirectly inspired revolutionary leaders across the continent, figures like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín.
So what does this all mean? The contradiction, the code, and the slavery, the meritocracy, and the censorship, it defines his genius.
Napoleon's genius lay in his ability to mobilize society through national conscription, unified law, and meritocracy for total war on an unprecedented scale. He was the force that simultaneously destroyed old, antiquated feudal regimes and imposed new, modernized, yet profoundly authoritarian structures across the continent. He simultaneously democratized violence and administration.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Poland is the only country in the world to evoke Napoleon in its national anthem, a direct result of his support for their cause against Prussia and Russia and their desire for national independence. Considering his cynical use of Allied troops, like the Poles, in the catastrophic, ruinous invasion of Russia, and his role in sparking nationalism all across Europe, we have to ask, was Napoleon's greatest reform the unification of his enemies against him?
That's the irony of history, isn't it? He attempted to consolidate the continent under French rule, but instead, his actions created the very forces, nationalism, liberalization, and a unified sense of resistance that ultimately dismantled his empire and shaped the 19th and 20th centuries.
A question for you to mull over until our next deep dive.